Welcome, everyone, to the captive audience. It is January 7th, 2025. And this is my first show of 2025. The last one we did was Sunny, Don, and myself on, I think it was the 30th of December. And looking back and looking forward a little bit. But now here we are in the new year. But we have one of our regular guests on who is a fabulous political analyst, consultant, media expert, and frankly, knows Oregon politics as well as national politics. Dave Huguenot. Dave, thanks for joining us here tonight.
Thanks for having me. It's good to have a. I feel special. I'm within the first week of the new year.
You are.
So.
Yeah, I think you're the first official guest, actually.
Wow.
And
I love it.
And it's a good new year in so many ways. I'm probably going to surprise you with one topic here in a minute, but we're in the Trump year, really, because it seems like Biden's almost over. He feels like he is over, and we are. Let's see, as of today, we are just 2 weeks out, right, from Inauguration Day.
Yeah, we are. 13 days away.
Yep.
So counting them down quick, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think couldn't happen soon enough. People are really, even people who didn't vote for him are saying, probably a good thing this is happening sooner versus later. And Joe Biden's been off vacationing a good percentage of the time. And when he's in the White House, he's useless. And he just gave an award to George Soros last night, Presidential Medal of Freedom, I think, which is one of the highest ironies I've ever come across. The guy funds literally everything on the far left. And then, of course, Hillary Clinton also received the same medal in that ceremony.
And you can't forget Liz Cheney was in that crowd too. Liz Cheney also got a medal of Freedom Medal, or whatever they call it. So
I think what she'd probably like to have more than a Freedom Medal is a pardon. But we'll see what happens. I don't know.
Well, I will say, in terms of Biden's health, it does seem like it's had a rough couple of weeks. But a really good friend of mine is actually a Democrat consultant. They do what I do, except they work for Democrats, whereas I work for Republicans. And she made a comment that the president wasn't looking that good a couple of days ago. And I told her, don't worry, he's going to look really good in about 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, they're going to jack him full of whatever it is they've been giving him for like the State of the Union and some of these speeches. And then they're going to polish him up. It's going to look like, in the Wizard of Oz. Do you remember when they take him into the Emerald City in the old Wizard of Oz, and they polish him, and they're doing their hair and they're fixing their shoes, and that's what they do. They probably put him through one of these things, and then boom, they march him out there. Well, they give him whatever they give him, and like 800 vitamin B12 shots or something, and then they just like go.
I'm kind of hoping for that moment. Like it's like the end of the Lord of the Rings too, where like after all that's done, they put him on the boat to go out to like the Misty Isles, or whatever they call it, right? Goes to live with the elves.
Yeah, or maybe kind of, what is it? Is it the Norse mythology where they push him out on a boat and then they shoot arrows into the boat with flaming arrows, and it lands in the boat, and then it just burns as a pyre off in the distance? That will be far better than what he's going to end up doing, which is he's going to have to spend the rest of his life with Dr. Jill Biden, going on the speaking circuit while he sits someplace probably drooling. I don't know. He's just he's not really got it anymore. He's done. And I think that he's still doing damage. That's probably the only reason why we know he's president, because he is he just issued some kind of executive orders for like stopping drilling or something offshore, and a whole bunch of other things that frankly don't sound like something a president who has no mandate at this point whatsoever should be doing, but he's doing it anyway.
Nope, I agree. I agree. I mean, some of the stuff he's doing, it seems nonsensical, very last minute. And it's also, I mean, I'm not exactly an executive order expert, but it seems to me as a layman, a lot of stuff that Trump can undo somewhat, basically just
Rapidly.
reverse as soon as he gets into office. So it's going to be an exciting January. I think this is going to be an exciting first 100 days for the Trump administration. What's interesting about this, there's a lot of firsts, right? This is the first, well, it's not the first, but it's I think the second time in American history that we've had someone be president for non-consecutive terms. I think the first one was Grover Cleveland, maybe.
Hmm.
It was one of those weird presidents that you forget it if you're taking like fifth grade civics. It's not a super famous one, but what's super fascinating to me, and I think is going to be really interesting and ultimately good for the country, is you have a President Trump who is not only going into a second term, which for those of you that don't really pay attention or don't have a lot of experience, really in depth in DC politics, it's not easy becoming president, even if you've been a politician all of your life, trying to
Right.
understand all the machinations of the Washington, D.C. bureaucracy. It is a complicated bureaucracy with tens of thousands of people.
Yep.
Trying to understand how to navigate, it takes a lot of presidents the first term to understand how to do it, and their second term is when they can really kind of get things going.
Momentum.
Um, right. So you kind of have that going with Trump. Like it's almost like this is kind of like he won his reelection and now he's going to have his second term. But on top of that, right, the fact that he had 4 years to think about, well, if I did have a second term, what would I do? With the knowledge that he gained from a first term, I am willing to bet that this is going to be a very unique year for how President Trump approaches the presidency. I think it's going to be unique in the amount of efficiencies they're able to create. I think also too, frankly, they'll be able to sidestep a lot of the drama. I mean, one of the things that the Trump administration was dogged with in 2016 after he won, or 2017, I should say, was having administration heads and having cabinet members that weren't necessarily a part of the team.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Deep
were
state in
yeah,
effect too. Yeah.
right. I just don't think you're going to have any of that this go around.
No.
It's going to be interesting. And I think it's something, if you're a conservative, if you care about limited government, if you care about some of the issues that Trump has been stumping on for the last better part of a decade, this is kind of the time I think a lot of that comes to fruition.
Yeah, and I think that uh, they are going to be able to do quite a few things rapidly, especially if it can go through the reconciliation process.
Yeah.
But Democrats are going to produce the drama whenever they can. And the first sign that drama is maybe going down on the Republican side might be what happened on January 3rd with the speaker vote, because it looked like we were going to have one of these, multiple votes, potentially something happening with Speaker Johnson not getting reelected. And then two guys probably got calls from President Trump, is my guess. And they flipped, and boom, he had exactly what he needed. And that was it.
Yeah.
Over. And then they came out with the rules a short time later. The new rules are going to require that there be 9 people to vacate the chair in order to hold a vote to vacate the chair. Before it was 1 in the Matt Gaetz era.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, the one time that I believe the chair was vacated, there were 8 votes to vacate the chair when they only needed 1. So I find it interesting that it now requires 9. But that means that maybe we're heading into a less drama, more let's just get this stuff done. Let's get our agenda done. Because there's a lot of stuff. They already are off to the races, by the way. And they brought back the SAVE Act. And I don't know if that's going to make it through the Senate, but I know they're going to pass it again through the House, and some Democrats are going to vote differently. And there's also some evidence that Democrats, a few of them who had their feet held to the fire in the last election cycle, as well as some new ones, they are voting differently than Democrats before, or what they like. I'll give you one example. The Laken Riley bill was just brought back. They voted on it. It did pass the House last time, but this time it passed the House in a bipartisan 264 to 159 vote, with 48 Democrats voting for it. And of course, Laken Riley was the Georgia nursing student who had her head bashed in by an illegal immigrant who had been arrested multiple times in multiple jurisdictions, and of course had come into the country illegally, and so they brought this bill back. Well, I learned today that one of the people who voted against it last year but voted for it this year, Val Hoyle, which is fascinating because I can tell you that her opponent, Monique Despain, made a big deal about her voting against the Laken Riley bill nearly every time she got to interview with somebody. Yeah. And I'm sure that there's a similar story, a similar message that's come across to a lot of these folks here that are Democrats. Maybe there's going to be some bipartisanship we didn't expect too. What do you think?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I think that there's pockets of the country that Democrats are in, Democrats hold congressional seats where, Trump was successful. Places like a little pockets of Oregon and Washington, but really more in the Midwest and some of the battleground states like, the Michigans, the Minnesotas, even the Iowas and Georgias and some of those other places. Arizona is another one, right, where I think Trump outperformed, the congressional ticket in a few places. So, if you're a Democrat and you're representing a district that Trump won or Trump did better than expected in or did well in, then sure, you're going to have to pause when the Democratic majority, the Democratic conference, I should say, is telling you to vote on something that that your district on some level doesn't like. And the SAVE Act is a good example of it. There's going to be other examples. I think it's really clear, kind of with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, looking at some of these races, I think a lot of Republican candidates were kind of bashful about talking about immigration and talking about the border. They were kind of afraid of, the backlash of, being called a racist or being called xenophobic or something like that. The reality is that I think was more top of mind and something that voters were more passionate about than I think a lot of politicians realized. And I think the ones that were successful, in part, were ones that were not bashful in talking about that. So I think, and one thing's true in politics, when candidates and politicians find a message that works, they definitely apply that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right. It's one of the reasons, we probably talked about Obamacare politically for like a decade, more than a decade. Right. Yeah. Because they knew it was unpopular. Same thing's going to be true for immigration for the next 2 years. I think you're going to continue to hear a lot about it. And, there's no doubt that it's going to be a cornerstone of what the Trump administration is trying to tackle. I mean, it's one of the biggest crises, if not the biggest, in our country at the moment.
Well, and it's a crisis that's not over because, for instance, one of the things that ICE put out on the day that Kamala Harris went to the border in, I think in September, they said as of the end of July, the Biden administration will let 650,000 people with criminal records into the country.
Right.
They identified that they had criminal records, and then they released them into the country. Well, those weren't, for jaywalking. They were murders, rapists, burglars, gang members, smugglers, all kinds of folks. And these folks are running around the country. It's going to take a long time to track them all down and send out 650,000 people, but they're probably the first ones that are going to get sent out. And so maybe it really is urgent to act quickly.
No, I think it'll be interesting to see how they go about it at the beginning of the administration. But there's no question it's going to be a priority for them. And to your point, and I think we've said this on previous shows. If you're a candidate running for office, when it comes to the border crisis and how you talk about it, I mean, it's like 3 or 4 different crises packed into one, right?
Yeah.
I think when we talk about illegal immigration, we probably, depending on who you are, you probably get some visualization of people illegally crossing the border, right, and then going to try to get a job in the United States.
Yeah,
that is certainly a large portion of it.
Dishes, right? Yeah.
Sorry, what's that?
Picking tomatoes, washing dishes.
Yeah, and look, and that's certainly a big chunk of the type of illegal immigration that's happening. But what really, there's so many different issues with the border that cause problems for our country. One is obviously, known criminals coming into the country and creating more crime in our states. That's definitely one. The other one, quite simply, is the drug crisis we have. Drugs like fentanyl, heroin, other methamphetamines. Those are getting into our country across the U.S.-Mexico border. So if you have a loved one, or if you know, or if you have a friend that has a loved one that's died of an overdose, likely you can trace that drug that they got back to Mexico in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Probably and then to a super lab or something, which got its precursors from China.
And then ultimately, I mean, the third one that's worth talking about, that's super important, is also just the overall human trafficking that happens, whether it's tricking people into prostitution or indentured servitude. There's tons of issues where we have a humanitarian crisis at the border, right? And those are all the crises before we even get to the conversation of what does a sound immigration policy for the United States look like.
That's right. Well, 300,000 kids that they lost track of, right? They got to go find them.
So, I mean, and I think that's one issue too. I mean, look, there's partisan reasons that I think, politicians haven't wanted to. I mean, if you're the Democrats, right, you don't want to do it because, for partisan reasons. But even former Republican presidents, whether it's George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, even Reagan to a certain extent, frankly, even Trump in his first term, I could argue, could have done more on the border, right? The reason that they don't, it's not like they don't care. It's a complicated and difficult issue to solve. What I'm excited about for this second Trump administration is, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, he has the experience of 4 years, and he has 4 years to kind of think about, well, what would I do differently this time, as opposed to jumping rather than just jumping right into your second term. You have 4 years to kind of plan and prepare for it. I think that Trump is poised to be the most effective president in solving our immigration crisis in the history of the country. That alone, I think, will make this administration historical.
Well, and I got to believe he's going to take the same approach to the economy and to energy, which are related, because we know that those two things have been, like all this regulation, all this, they're going to do this at like hyper speed. Last time it took them like 18 months to do even the fastest things that they did.
Yeah.
But now they have to extend the Trump tax cuts because that would be a real blow to the economy if they didn't get around to doing that. And then the massive amount of regulations, the inflation causing spending that has been going on. And that if the economy starts to skid or people become unhappy with the economy, they do blame the current administration at some point for what's happening. And Trump's not going to sit around and wait for some eggheads to tell him what to do. He's going to be like, let's get it done now.
Right.
And then I think the same thing for energy. Like, we're not going to be worried about where our energy is coming from. We're going to have as much of it as we need, and it's going to be cheap. And so there's plenty of damage that has been done by the Biden administration, but some of this can be undone pretty quickly with a determined president and a Congress that's ready to act.
Right. Yeah. And I think to your point on sort of the drama in the Congress, I do agree. I think at least on the Republican conference side, the Gateses and some of those folks that were really kind of troublemakers, they've either left or they've kind of gotten their they've scratched that itch for whatever constituency they were trying to please. And then also just the overall, frankly, the theatrics of the Congress, which there are theatrics involved regardless of what party you are. The theatrics change when you are also of the same party of the presidency too. And then on top of that, we also have a majority in the Senate. So, you know, in terms of the games that you want to play, I mean, if you're a congressman right now, this is an opportunity to show results for your constituency. You know, you can show that you solved a crisis, that you improve the economy, you maybe lower taxes, all those types of things. The reality is, not to be a Debbie Downer on your glorious show, Kevin, but if history tells us anything, if you're a Republican in DC right now, you should only expect to have 2 years, a little less than 2 years, frankly, to get this done. Because
if you're in an at-risk seat, you better risk it on the right things.
Well, and just the probability of Republicans holding the House in 2026 is going to be very difficult, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was, you know, the size of the conference now, I think, underperformed what most people were hoping and expecting. So they have a very slim majority at the moment. Going into a midterm election where they're of the same party as the presidency, typically, you know, I don't know the numbers offhand, but just in my personal experience, I've been working in politics for over 20 years now. I can't think of a midterm election in my lifetime where I've been paying attention where the party in power hasn't lost seats.
Yeah.
And
there's one 2002 and
2002. Yeah. Okay. Yep. I figured I knew I was missing one and that makes perfect sense. It would be right in that sweet spot. And then I also remember in 2006 we got walloped.
We got shellacked.
Yeah.
Obama would say.
So, you know,
in fact, we just got rid of a few of the senators, Tester and a few others that got elected in the class of 2006, and so it can take quite a while to get rid of these guys too once they get in there. Even though they're in a state you'd think they wouldn't be able to hold out.
Right. You know, and then and I think what's also going to be interesting in the Senate, you know, I've been paying a lot of attention to Fetterman in Pennsylvania. To me, he's kind of unpredictable, but in a way that I think is going to be beneficial to the Trump administration. I think he's obviously going to be, you know, he's no fan of Trump, and he says that all the time, right? But when it comes to him voting, I think he will vote a little more purple than some of his Democratic colleagues.
Which senator?
Fetterman, Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah, no, he sounds like he's actually really on board with some of this stuff sometimes. I don't know, proof's in the pudding, right? But he really does sound like he has chastised some fellow Democrats for being stupid on some things.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah. So yeah, no, I think it's going to be if you're a Republican in DC right now, especially if you're in the Congress, whether you're in a safe seat or a swing seat, you know that, you know, this is, I mean, maybe not knows not the right word. You should plan as if you're not going to be in the majority in 2027.
And if you are, it's going to be because something you're doing now, you can talk about in that next election that people are going to care about, right?
Right. Well, and again, I mean, I was having this conversation with a colleague of mine a couple days ago about what may happen in the midterms. Is it going to be really tough for Republicans? Are we going to get shellacked like we did in 2006 or in 2018? Or is it going to be different? To your point, Kevin, you know, you mentioned 2002 was the only time that we didn't lose. Well, you know, that is right after 9/11, right we're in the midst of the beginnings of the war in Afghanistan. I don't think we had invaded Iraq yet. That would have been 2003.
That was 2003. That was March 2003.
So it was right after the midterms. Like it was, you know, George Bush's approval rating, I think it was like in the 80% at something like that. It was astronomically, historically high. So, you know, the question would be what circumstances can be created between now and 2026 for that type of, you know, and it probably does mean that there's some sort of foreign policy victory or sort of rally around the flag for the Republicans. And there's a few opportunities for that. I mean, there's you still have the conflict in Ukraine. You've got it seems like we're constantly flirting with war with China, especially the last couple of years. The Middle East right now is, just as a mess as it's ever been. I mean, even my hometown in New Orleans was attacked by ISIS just a week ago.
I know. Well, guess what? I didn't get to tell you this. So this is the news I was going to surprise you with. So you might be aware that there was a Sugar Bowl going on there with a team that I'm connected with.
That's right.
I was there, and I walked. Oh, really? I walked on Bourbon Street, maybe 2.5 hours before the attack. And the guy was we might have walked past him because he went there earlier and put IEDs down on Bourbon Street in the form of coolers that looked like they just had beers in them or something. And the fortunate thing is how on the river there, the fireworks on New Year's Eve, just decided not to go down Bourbon Street specifically on the way back, but went nearby, went up Canal, and then kind of over to just avoid the crowds, because we knew that everybody leaving the fireworks, there was going to be just a giant mass of people heading to Bourbon Street. And
right.
But you're right. This is an issue because I just don't think there's been somebody that's been quite as focused and professional about protecting the country, in charge of the country. I don't even know who's in charge of the country right now. I don't know who that phone call went to, but I know Joe Biden wasn't the most important person who got a phone call after that attack in Washington, D.C. And so we're going to have stuff happening. There's stuff that you just can't predict that can definitely change what we're all talking about. And of course, what's the best example other than 9/11 is COVID. Like who was predicting that?
Right.
A couple of years out, and there will be something that won't be predicted that could make a difference and change what we're talking about. Having said that, I just have immensely more confidence that, a president who brought peace and prosperity 5 years ago is going to be way better at handling this than the guy who was responsible for Afghanistan and inflation and the things that they just seemed to either deny were happening or claimed it was something they either couldn't do anything about or it was someone else's fault. And everybody's done with that, right? We're all done with that. So.
Right. Well, first, obviously, glad that you're back home safe in Oregon. Glad that you spent some money in my city as well. Or we need that. We need that tourism revenue.
Yeah.
I'll just to go back to the attack in New Orleans. I mean, because it's been a big deal, obviously, for a lot of folks home. I've kind of got a weird perspective on it. It's kind of hit me weird, I should say, because I've lived all over the country. I've lived in Washington, D.C. I've lived in the shadow of New York City. I've lived in major, metropolitan areas where terrorist attacks have happened. And you would expect if a terrorist is going to attack it, they're going to attack in D.C. or New York or Philadelphia or some of these other places. Living in New Orleans, and I lived in New Orleans post 9/11, through the Iraq War, through the early 2000s, I never felt like, if you're a terrorist, like you're going to put New Orleans on your map. Right. Like, we're not a first strike city. So there was always this like level of safety of like, terrorist attacks. Like that's Eastern Seaboard problem. In New Orleans, we just got to worry about Mardi Gras and making sure we've got a designated driver for the evening. Like that's our biggest fear. So it was jarring in the sense, and it was obviously jarring for what the attack was in and of itself. But it was also just jarring where it was like a place that I always felt was just safe and secure from that type of stuff was no longer, right? It kind of took the veneer off of my hometown for me a little bit. And to your point, in terms of where that attack was, I don't think my parents watched this stream, so I can kind of speak a little candidly. I don't want to say how many times I've been on that corner on Canal and Bourbon. I've been there plenty. Yeah. That is kind of your last stop of the night. When you're getting off of Bourbon and you're ready to go back to your hotel, There's a couple of 24-hour restaurants right there. You're going to grab a burger or something like that just to kind of, frankly, sober up a little bit. And yeah, that's where you're winding down your night right there.
Yeah.
And just to know that that's where that was really scary. The other thing too that's been frustrating as the stories have unfolded was, again, just seeing some of the mistakes that were made by the NOPD that kind of allowed that attack to be worse than what it should have been.
Yeah, definitely.
Bourbon Street is a street that you can drive down, right? On a normal Monday, if you wanted to drive down Bourbon Street, you could. It's a street. But for big events, for big nights, usually weekends, they have, these big barriers they put up so you can't physically drive a car through. Those have apparently not been working since Mardi Gras because Mardi Gras beads got stuck in one of them, and for whatever reason they hadn't fixed it. But they should have been up. And
they said they were gonna fix it for the Super Bowl, and like the Sugar Bowl is a pretty big deal, actually.
It is. And I've been to the Sugar Bowl there. Even if LSU is not playing in the Sugar Bowl, I'll still go to, if when I lived in Louisiana, I still go down there because it's always a good time. It's always fun watching the out of towners. Frankly, kind of go a little crazy. Kind of people watch a little bit, but it's so that part of it, that's always the next tragedy after the tragedy, is finding out what could have happened differently to make it not as bad. But yeah, no, it's been heartbreaking to see what happened.
Well, and I think it was a message to a lot of places in the country that think that they're not the target, but there's a large gathering of people who weren't expecting anything to happen. You know what the real warning sign for them is what happened in Germany, where that guy drove into a crowd. It's pretty similar.
Right.
And it was just a Christmas market in town that in Eastern Germany that's like not accustomed to anything happening. And they're used to just, selling gingerbread and speculoos and all these little treats and candles, and all of a sudden some guy comes barreling in there and runs people over. It was very similar. And you're right, the NOPD definitely has some splaining to do. Senator John Kennedy sounds like, well, here's what he said. I watched his face at the press conference. The governor seems to be on top of things much more. At the Super Bowl, at the Superdome, at the Sugar Bowl, the mayor got booed pretty severely at the Sugar Bowl, but while the governor got applauded. But one thing was pretty obvious, is that the sort of foot dragging and finger pointing that started right away is not indicative of somebody who was ready. And then the other thing I heard from a local resident is that the NOPD isn't really in charge of things like the Super Bowl. They actually have the state police do that because they're just kind of concerned that NOPD can't handle the Superdome.
Yeah, well, it's typically, it's not necessarily because the NOPD can't. There's plenty of criticisms to offer to the NOPD, but like we'll do the same thing for like LSU games. Like it's not the Baton Rouge police or the campus police. It's state police that'll come in. It's because the events are so big. They're big. One of the things I don't know the stats for the Sugar Bowl or like how many people were in attendance, because it also kind of buttresses with the New Year's holiday as well. But for Mardi Gras, the city of New Orleans will have an additional 1 to 1.5 million people in the city that normally don't live there.
Which very few towns that size, because that's more than the population of the city, isn't it?
Yeah. It's been a while since I've looked at the actual population. It's probably under 1 million or right at about 1 million. So it's like the size of the city doubles, right, overnight. It's probably not that extreme for the Sugar Bowl, but you can imagine it's at least an additional, 200,000 to 300,000 people that are in the city, and not just in the city, spread across all wards, right? They are all within this really tight area around the Superdome and around the French Quarter. So it is a lot to handle. There's a lot of people moving that has to go on. But I think it's this weird thing with New Orleans where a lot of the tragedies that you see right? This terrorist act, there were these barriers that were built to protect people, but were broken and never fixed. Frankly, go back to Katrina in 05 when I lived there, when we flooded.
Stories like that back then.
If you look at why the levees failed, it's because the New Orleans Parish side of the levees weren't properly taken care of. The Jefferson Parish side, right? Because these levees are on the sides of canals and things like that.
Yeah.
They have two sides. It was the Orleans Parish side that broke, and when the Army Corps of Engineers came to investigate, they found that the Orleans Parish side wasn't as well taken care of as the Jefferson Parish side. And there are elected levee board positions within New Orleans, or maybe they're appointed now. They used to be elected, but so it's this constant sort of tragedy with my city. It's and I've got this love-hate relationship with it, where New Orleans it's such a unique and vibrant town, and there's no other place in the world like it. And I've been all over, but the leadership there is just, and you could call them corrupt, and that would be fair. You can call them, you could call them lazy. You call them incompetent. But it's like I don't know if there's a word in the English language that combines all of that into one, right?
Yeah.
Like that's, and it's heartbreaking, because I always think of what the city could be. I mean, that the New Orleans, in my opinion, should be the most important city in the United States because of where it's at, because of its port, and a lot of because of the energy that goes through there.
Energy, yeah.
But it's not. It's we jokingly refer to it as the northernmost banana republic, and and it earns that moniker time and time again.
Yep. Well, Pat Finley here made a point. It's like he says he hates crowds, but he says shooters love them, and I think we've kind of gone to sleep on thinking about what kind of threats could exist and how people need to act or be proactive on it. I think the current administration in a lot of places in the country are very reactive to this stuff. They go and they solve the problem after it's happened. And here's a great example of this. One that, New Orleans was just the target that day, right? There was something that happened in Las Vegas, which was really weird and didn't seem to be connected in the end. But still, that guy was just not good at blowing himself up. Something could have really happened there too, and no one was watching for that. I saw a video of the guy from inside the hotel of the guy's car, and I'm like, I'm not standing there to video something when I hear pop, 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 boom coming from outside the window in a vehicle, because that could be anything. But this is one. It's carnage from the sky. Experts warn of new terrorist drone threat to U.S. after New Orleans. We're not even really prepared for that next thing. And they have learned a lot about drones in Ukraine, what they can do and how they can be used. Both the good guys and the bad guys have learned that. So I think there's a real concern that if we're not on top of this, if we don't stay ahead of the game, and especially if we let anybody into the country across any open space, which we've been doing for almost 4 years, anyone can come in. Anyone.
Yeah, no, it reminds me of Donald Rumsfeld talking about kind of the failures that led up to 9/11, but also the failures that led up to Pearl Harbor. Right? It's fundamentally it's a failure of imagination. We're unable to imagine what people that want to hurt us are capable of doing. Right? And I think you're right. I think a lot of places, a lot of institutions rest on their laurels, and they fail to imagine. And not saying that I'd want to sit down every day and clock in and imagine ways people want to hurt, but I mean, that's what some people are paid to do, whether it's the FBI or the state police or the NOPD or the Portland PD. Your job is to imagine, if someone wanted to come into our city or our town or our community and cause damage, how would they do it?
And what would you do when it happened?
What would you do to stop it? Yep.
Yeah. And I'll say that sometimes we just follow a procedure, but we don't think about how someone who wants to circumvent that procedure and accomplish something will look at it. One of the best examples, I think, is I go to the Timbers games, right? And you get there, there's big long lines outside the entrances, and the entrances have these metal detectors that you have to go through. And yeah, and if you have a purse or stuff in your pocket, you have to take all that out. And I'm thinking there's like literally at peak, probably 700 or 800 people all standing outside trying to get in. All the security is to keep people from getting into the stadium. Well, if I'm a terrorist, I'm not going in. I got 700 or 800 people right there.
Right.
Duh. And this is where we're at now. And I'm thinking one of the key things for the new administration is they have to get their people confirmed and into positions as quickly as possible. That was a problem leading up to 9/11 because they didn't, they just didn't have a bunch of the people even in positions yet, and yet they were suddenly finding themselves in a crisis. I think the FBI director, the new one, was like had been in the office for like 3 days or something, and then 9/11 hit. That was months after the administration came in. And then there's, of course, what happened with the Trump administration, where it really, really took a long time. Now, it's great that we have both houses of Congress, and in particular, the Senate should be able to do this without any filibusters slowing anything down. But I still think there's a concern. When is the best time to do something to the United States? And that's not just domestic, but it could be people doing stuff overseas. And that's when you don't have your leadership in place, or even have leadership from the last administration that's still sort of caretakers that aren't doing the right things sometimes.
Right. No, I agree. It'll be, I think the good news is that when it comes to this incoming administration, I mean, there's not going to be much patience for people that want to do our country harm. In fact, I mean, I saw another press conference from President Trump. I think it might be a day or two old, but I saw it this morning, where he reminded Hamas that if they don't release hostages before he becomes president, there's going to be hell to pay.
Yeah.
I have no doubt that he's going to keep that promise if Hamas keeps us. And reality is, when it comes to terrorist organizations, when it comes to world leaders too, I mean, you kind of have to carry a big stick. And I don't know that you necessarily need to always speak softly. Sometimes you have to speak plainly on, and make people understand what the consequence, if they choose to do us harm, what the consequence is going to be.
They need to be that it's the bad guys who need to lack confidence in what they think you're going to do. They need to think that the worst possible scenario could hit them, that they could be Soleimani'd, that they could find themselves one day thinking, we got these guys, let's do whatever we want. And the next thing you know, a missile hits their car and turns it into a piece of burnout scrap. And everybody's like, oh, crapola.
Right.
That's and by the way, if you're going to issue a warning at the beginning of the administration, you really do have to follow through, because that sets the tone. Like, the next guy you warn is going to say, oh, yeah, actually, he did do something about that. I'm not going to mess with this guy.
Right.
You don't want to do what Biden did, which is literally open the door to the bad guys in the world to think they can do whatever they want because of how he handled and failed to admit the failure of Afghanistan.
Right.
Withdrawal.
Right. No, I mean, to your point, right? I was just about to say, the Afghanistan withdrawal and how botched that was. You had foreign policy blunder after blunder with the Biden administration, where you had our enemies causing damage to the United States, to our citizens. I mean, we had soldiers that were killed in Afghanistan during with the withdrawal. The Taliban saw no retribution from the United States because of that. We basically, just allowed Russia to walk into Ukraine, right? There was no hard line. There was no conversation, right? And I want to be careful, because I'm not necessarily, I'm not necessarily trying to be in favor of one policy position or another. But I think fundamentally the failure of the Biden administration is that it was clear that they weren't going to be clear on anything.
Yeah.
They were, they obviously didn't like the idea of Russia invading Ukraine, but they just showed some serious displeasure when it happened. I think that's going to be one of the things that's different with this incoming administration is you're going to see things spoken in plain English. And I think that's going to ultimately be to our country's benefit.
What do you think of the nominees that we got? Are we going to be in pretty good shape, and are they going to get through at least a good portion? Because there's some of them, they're edgy, but they're what Trump wants.
Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, some of the ones like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK are probably getting the most news clips. I think with Gates dropping out and Bondi becoming the attorney general nominee, that was the one that if I was playing who's going to lose their nomination bingo, I would have picked him.
Yeah.
I I don't. There's no one that strikes me as like, yeah, they're not gonna make it. I think every single nominee, the vast majority of the nominees, to be clear, are gonna get confirmed without issue, including Oregon's Lori Chavez Dreamer. I think that's fait. Those are fait accompli. For the ones that are a little bit tougher, like the RFKs and the Tulsis, I still think they ultimately get confirmed. They just have to go through a few extra hoops. It's rare in American history that a cabinet member isn't confirmed by the Senate. It happens, but I don't know that the circumstances around some of the more controversial nominees have risen to that occasion yet.
Well, and it usually gets scuttled before it reaches a vote if there really is a danger of not passing. And now, without a filibuster mattering, this is just going to be an inside discussion between Republican senators and the White House. And They're just going to tell them, like, we don't have the votes, or we do, or you got to do this to get the votes from these guys, call them up and work the phones. But I also think that there's a lot of people who are afraid to, a lot of people in Congress who maybe are not afraid, but reticent to stand in the way of the transformative change that needs to happen, that they all ran on, and that President Trump plans to do. Like, that was the thing about the House and the vote for Speaker. It probably wasn't going to accomplish anything as far as changing what a Speaker is or does in the House of Representatives, but it could have delayed yesterday's confirmation of the Electoral College, right? And so stuff like that, right now, you're not negotiating with the Biden administration or Chuck Schumer anymore.
Right.
Now that you don't have to do that, then all you're doing is getting in the way of Republicans implementing their agenda.
Right.
That's got to be a really unpopular thing for almost any Republican to do.
100%. No, if you're a Republican, it's going to be very, very tough to vote no on some of these nominees. And ultimately, I also think too, you're going to have some Democrats that vote for these nominees as well. Again, whether it's Fetterman in Pennsylvania or senators from places like Arizona or Georgia or Michigan or Minnesota, their constituency supports the Trump agenda. So for them, they're definitely going to not to vote to confirm some nominees. They're not going to vote for 100% of them.
Yeah.
But if you're a Fetterman in Pennsylvania, right, I'll kind of keep picking on him. You want to find some opportunities to show some bipartisanship, right? Because if you're Fetterman, you've got re-election in 2 years, or no, sorry, that's not wrong, 4 years. Or wait, yeah.
No, he's going to be
22.
Yeah, he's elected in 2022, I think.
Yeah. So I guess he's up in 4 years. But but ultimately, like, if you're one of these Democratic senators, you want to find opportunities to look bipartisan if you can. If you represent some of these redder or more pro-Trump states, and voting for some of these nominees, not necessarily all of them, kind of gives you the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I don't know if there's any other stories you wanted to hit, but one last story that I thought was interesting for the day today is Jimmy Carter. He was just, I guess it was his. They brought him to DC, or he was in Georgia for sort of the Georgia state funeral.
Yeah, they had like a private funeral here, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess. What did they actually bring? I thought that he wasn't going to do the presidential funeral. I guess they are going to do that for him.
I know that he's going to lie in state on January 9th.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Biden confirmed that, assuming Biden's actually a reasonable source for any of this now. But it is something that required at least the assent of the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader to do it. Gotcha. And then, so they did that. But, when I think there's a lot of people talking about what a wonderful guy he was, but he was not a good president, and he was probably one of the history would say one of the two biggest um, failures as president in the 20th century. A lot of people would point to Herbert Hoover as being the other,
Yeah.
but and Jimmy Carter was actually, for many people, more well known for his post presidency of charitable work and good causes. I frankly thought that the fact that he stayed out of um, politics pretty much after that was to his credit, because we know that that's actually not what Bill Clinton, and most certainly not what
Yeah.
Barack Obama's been doing. They've been behind the scenes pulling strings for decades now. And but when I think of Jimmy Carter, I think of there was maybe one thing that I think of that he did that was good, which was the Camp David Peace Accords.
Mhm.
That was an accomplishment, and that was meaningful. And then, like nearly everything else, including stuff that what Democrats think were accomplishments, like the Department of Education and the Department of Energy, uh, the um, the Panama Canal Treaty is starting to look not so great now,
Right.
uh, and and of course inflation, malaise. Frankly, he almost lost the Cold War. He had the
Right.
Soviets convinced that they were going to win.
Right.
So the number one good thing about him, other than Camp David peace accords, is that he made everybody realize they needed Ronald Reagan. And I think, wow, isn't this interesting? Like, we're in this parallel, like history repeating itself. We needed 4 years of Joe Biden for someone like President Trump to win the presidency with the popular vote and
Right.
an agenda that seems broadly popular in the American people at this point.
No, I think the analogy's spot on. Yeah, and obviously, respect to President Carter. I agree. Was not a good president. Was not a president that if I was alive to vote for him, I would have voted for him. Um, but certainly the work that he did in his post presidency, Habitat for Humanity, that sort of stuff. It's commendable, and the fact that he would dedicate his life to that type of cause, I think is certainly something to aspire to. It's funny. My wife's family's from Georgia, and her family kind of they're all over the spectrum in terms of their partisanship. But it's always funny to me that no matter how Republican you are in the state of Georgia, the amount of people that just absolutely love Jimmy Carter here.
Yeah.
His popularity here just seems to transcend partisanship and politics. He is definitely considered one of the best exports by the state of Georgia. So the best export would be my wife. Jimmy Carter's maybe a close second.
Well, and it's a favorite son type of thing too, isn't it? A little bit, but
Yeah, I
it's
think so.
the realistic assessment, which you do usually after the funeral's over. I guess I know I'm jumping the gun here, is to kind of look at history and say, what was his effect on history? And I think I named three things,
Right.
which was the Camp David Peace Accords, which was what happened to the country while he was president in terms of the economy, which we saw repeat kind of under Biden.
Right.
And then what happened on foreign policy and the hostage crisis, the weakness of America, which felt like maybe Jimmy Carter's version of the Afghanistan withdrawal that has made people realize they needed a strong, resolute president who meant what he
Right.
is what he says.
I was going to point out, with the Iranian hostage crisis, I mean, it feels very similar to what's going on with Israel Hamas right now.
Yes.
Right? Trump's inheriting his own sort of hostage crisis after a one-term Democratic president. There are a lot of similarities, and I think that in a lot of ways, America is ready for a renaissance, economically, socially, culturally, from a foreign policy perspective. I think no matter where you are in America, you can't look back on the last 4 to 6 years and be like, yep, this has been perfect. So I think that there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic on what the next few years might look like.
Well, I think we'll have to get together again here in some weeks down the road. We usually come on about once a month, I think, and we'll have to talk about where we think things are heading politically, especially as the inauguration happens and the new administration gets underway, because politics is always happening. And in fact, everybody is always looking at what can I do to shape what happens in the next election, which, as you and I both know, started on November 6th. Everybody was already trying to figure that out. Like I said, Val Hoyle's trying to figure that out by voting for the Laken Riley Act. And there are many others who are starting to think about what can they do to solidify their position or compete in 2026. So we'll have to get back together and talk about this. Now, one last thing. What's your predictions at this point in the college football playoff? We got Texas and Ohio State in the, where is that? That's in the Cotton Bowl on Friday. And then we've got Notre Dame and Penn State in the Orange Bowl on Thursday.
Well, I will say Notre Dame really surprised me with Georgia. I got that one dead wrong.
You and all the Georgia fans, by the way, because they were really confident.
If you had asked me to guess which SEC team would be in the Final Four, I wouldn't have guessed Texas. I feel like Texas has to lose this go around. I feel like they're living on borrowed time. So, I could see a Notre Dame, Ohio State college football final. No offense to you and your kin. I just think Ohio State's the team to beat right now. They've been pretty dominant, and I just don't know if I see that changing, with the exception of their super embarrassing loss to Michigan. How they lost that game, I still don't understand. But I think Ohio State winning is probably the bet I'd go with. But watch me be wrong again.
Well, we got 2 games for each set of teams to go, and I don't disagree with you that's probably what we're hearing from the odds makers. After the shellacking of Oregon, people really feel that way about Ohio State. But let's not forget they lost 2 games, or did they lose a third?
I love pointing out to all my friends, by the way, that Oregon and LSU won the exact same amount of playoff games this year.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I mean, LSU, talk about an SEC team that's going to be competitive. The only thing I can say in Notre Dame's defense is they did beat the SEC champion, who did win it fair and square over Texas. And different teams had interesting paths that weren't necessarily quite as difficult to get where they're going.
Right. Right. Well, we'll see where it goes. I'm excited to watch the game on Thursday, though.
Yeah, me too. And I'm sure I'll get a text from you regardless of how it goes, right? So,
yeah. So
anyway,
awesome.
Well, and let's continue to keep in our thoughts and prayers the folks in New Orleans that were affected by all this, because it's just really difficult. And let's make sure that people learn some lessons from this nationally, including the politicians who might want to move on, but there's people that can't move on from what happened on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, actually it was. So, and it's a great town. New Orleans is a great town.
Yeah, we love it.
Yep. Well, thanks, Dave, for being on, and we'll have you on here post-inaugural at some point to talk what happens next. Thanks, everybody, for watching the Captive Audience tonight, and we'll be back tomorrow with the next episode of the Captive Audience. Should be Sunny and Don. Have a great night.